Ascendis Health has posted a 5% slide in first half revenue. This reflects subdued consumer spending, product pricing pressure and competitive forces within the medical device market. But the pharmaceuticals firm has reported a return to profit during the period. Operating profit rose to 47 million rand after a loss of 122 million rand a year ago. That's as the group focused on aggressively reducing and restructuring costs. Also factored into that amount is a provision reversal related to VAT and an accounting gain following the acquisition of Surgical Innovations. With these non-recurring items stripped out, adjusted operating profit amounted to 8.9 million rand. Ascendis is in the process of delisting from the JSE, and the board says it remains of the view that this is a critical step in the process of unlocking value for shareholders. It has offered investors 80 cents per share. TFG has handed its purse strings over to Ralph Buddle. He is currently the group's head of finance and advisory, but will take up the position of CFO from Monday. CEO Anthony Thernstrom has been filling the role of CFO since the beginning of December. That's after Bongiwe Ntuli resigned from the position. Renergen says its helium system integration is nearly complete and no significant issues have been detected. The company is now in the process of completing the last set of pre-checks and assessments before embarking on the next step of commercial liquefaction for customers. Looking ahead, Renergen says its focus will be on ramping up production and increasing efficiency and reliability. Zeda has received several approaches from third parties regarding its POEM division and Zard Holdings. The agribusiness-focused investment holding group says it wants to consider these approaches in a manner that is fair to the third parties and fair to the respective management teams of the portfolio investments. The firm expects the evaluation of these approaches to take several months to finalize. President Cyril Ramaphosa has established a water talks team under the leadership of Deputy President Paul Mashatile. The move seeks to tackle supply challenges throughout the country. Old infrastructure and a lack of maintenance is a common problem in many of the municipalities affected. The team includes Water and Sanitation Minister Senzo Mchunu, Cooperative Government and Traditional Affairs Minister Thembi Nkadimeng, Human Settlements Minister Mamuluk Okubayi, Electricity Minister Hosien Soramokgopa and Police Minister Bheki Cele. Further afield, China will lift anti-dumping and anti-subsidy tariffs on Australian wine. Here's more detail in this package report.
Australian wine is back on the menu for China. Beijing announced it will lift anti-dumping and anti-subsidy tariffs on wine from Australia. It ends 3 years of levies and offers long-awaited relief for Australian producers. China's Ministry of Commerce spokesperson He Yadong.
Given that the situation in China's wine market has changed, the anti-dumping and anti-subsidy tariff imposed on wine imported from Australia is no longer necessary.
The tariffs of up to 218.4% were first imposed in March 2021, along with a number of other trade barriers on Australian commodities. It began after relations soured between the two countries when Canberra called for a probe into the origins of COVID-19. Ties have improved significantly since last year. China has steadily lifted trade hurdles on Australian goods ranging from barley to coal. Australian wines imported into China used to be subject to zero tariffs, but by the first half of last year, Australian wine made up just 0.14% of Chinese wine imports. Official data showed in 2020, before the duties were introduced, it was as high as 27%. The Australian government said it welcomed the outcome at a critical time for the country's wine industry.
Meanwhile, the EU is mulling radical change to how it funds poorer members of the union. Let's check in with our reporter Anatindevu for more.
Well, that's right, Ndawleng. The European Commission is considering a radical change to how it funds its poorer members. Now, the 27-nation bloc is looking to transform its so-called cohesion fund, which is worth an estimated 392 billion euros. Now, to give us more detail on this is Deutsche Welle's Cassandra Sant in Berlin. Cassandra, maybe start off by telling us what reforms are on the table.
Well, this is basically changing the cohesion fund to a performance-based funding mechanism. You noted that big number before. The fund is worth 392 billion euros, and that's just for the period between 2021 and 2027. To put this into perspective, that fund alone is about 1/4 of the EU's budget for that period. Now, this reform would basically attach strings to the funding for the first time. The proposed model takes some notes from the rules attached to the EU's post-pandemic cash fund. Basically, under that scheme, Brussels linked cash transfers to the adoption of domestic reforms and aimed to reward progress along the way. But that didn't always go smoothly, with the post-COVID cash transfers being basically covered with red tape due to strict audits and controls. Now, back to this proposed reform. All of the bloc's 27 commissioners signed off on the document with the proposed reforms yesterday, which agreed on some criteria. And that report from the Commission says that it hopes that a, quote, cash for reforms model would potentially accelerate financial implementation. But there would still have to be a formal proposal as part of the next 7-year budget, and that would come into force in 2028.
Maybe, Cassandra, you can take us through why exactly these kinds of reforms are suddenly up for discussion now.
Well, in recent years, the European Union has struggled to persuade some members to stick to democratic standards. They've even withheld funding, but only in some limited ways. Namely, here we are talking about Hungary and Poland. So making this kind of cohesion financing dependent on reforms right from the start could make it easier to keep member states from tilting into full-fledged anti-democratic states. But I should say, this isn't just about problems with countries that are already within the fold of the European Union. The EU has a membership roadmap for several West Balkan countries like Albania and Macedonia, but also on the table is a potential membership for Ukraine.
While speaking of Ukraine, access for the country's agricultural exports to the EU is kicking up quite a hornet's nest. So what's at stake there?
That's right. Ukraine has long been known as the breadbasket of Europe. It's a massive grain exporter in particular. And since the start of the full-scale Russian war in Ukraine, the EU has liberalized trade for Ukraine to make it easier to get agricultural products out of the country, even bringing some of those exports into the European single market. But that has caused a lot of consternation among farmers in Europe during recent negotiations. For this year, for example, there was this last-minute push from Poland and France to further restrict Ukrainian goods. Now, there was a lot of back and forth, but in the end, there was a compromise set of restrictions that was proposed by the Belgian delegation. That means that Ukraine might only, and I say only here, lose up to 331 million euros in lost trade revenues. That was a lot less of an impact than some of the restrictions from Poland and France were proposing. But for a country as cash-strapped as Ukraine, every cent counts. Kyiv slammed the proposed restrictions as baseless, while saying that these measures do nothing to address the root cause of the EU farmers' problems. Some of these protests were what really ignited the restrictions coming from Poland and France during this negotiation process. So to answer your question, what's at stake is money. Naturally, this whole thing has obviously been a headache for officials, but if we're really going to read the tea leaves a bit here, it could also be a preview of the difficulties that both sides would face if Ukraine were to join the European Union.
Well, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for those insights. That was Cassandra Sant from DW.